Telepathic communication with pets. Does it work? Have you ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt like they were trying to tell you something? Ever felt that shiver down your spine when your cat appeared out of nowhere just as you were thinking about them? Or perhaps you've experienced that inexplicable moment when you arrived home and your pet was already waiting for you at the door, even though you'd completely changed your routine that day. If you answered yes to any of these questions, you're not alone, and more importantly, you're not crazy. There's a phenomenon gaining increasing attention around the world, something that combines science, spirituality, deep emotional connection, and a dash of what many call the paranormal, telepathic communication with pets. But does it really work? Or is it just another one of those internet fads that promise miracles and deliver disappointment? Get ready, because what you'll discover in the following lines could completely change the way you relate to your four-legged best friend. Telepathic communication with animals isn't exactly a novelty invented by modern-day digital influencers. In fact, ancient cultures across the planet have always believed in and practiced forms of deep connection with animals that transcended traditional verbal language. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, African tribes, Australian Aboriginal communities, and Asian shamanic traditions have always maintained a relationship of intuitive communication with animals, treating them not as property or simple companions, but as beings endowed with consciousness, complex emotions, and even ancestral wisdom. For these people, communicating with animals through mental images, sensations, and intuitions was as natural as breathing. They didn't need apps, online courses, or scientific validation to know this connection was real. But then what happened? Why have we, as a modern technological society, become so distant from this ability? The answer lies in the way we've been conditioned to value only that which can be measured, weighed, proven in laboratories, and published in prestigious scientific journals. We've literally unlearned how to trust our intuition, our ability to perceive subtle energies, and our deep connection with other living beings. And the most ironic thing of all is that now, just as science begins to uncover evidence that supports what our ancestors have always known, we look at these ancient practices with a mixture of arrogant skepticism and cautious curiosity. But let's get straight to the point. What the heck is telepathic communication with pets, anyway? When we talk about animal telepathy, we're not necessarily talking about sitting in a lotus position, closing your eyes, and hearing your dog's voice narrate your childhood memories with a dramatic soundtrack in the background. That's not quite how it works, although some people report experiences that come close. Telepathic communication with animals is actually a much more subtle and multifaceted process than simply hearing words inside your head. It involves receiving mental images, physical sensations in your own body that reflect what the animal is feeling, sudden emotions that aren't yours but the pet's, intuitive impressions about the animal's wants or needs, and even that instant knowledge about something related to your companion that you can't logically explain where it came from. It's as if there's an invisible communication channel between the two of you, a specific frequency that can be tuned in when you learn to silence the constant mental noise that characterizes the modern human mind. And here's the crucial point that most people don't understand. This isn't a mystical ability reserved only for special, enlightened, or paranormally gifted individuals. According to practitioners and scholars in this field, every human being is born with the ability to communicate telepathically, especially with animals. But this ability atrophies over the years due to lack of use and social programming that teaches us to rely solely on the 5 traditional physical senses and linear rational thinking. Now you might be wondering, is there any scientific basis for this, or is it all just belief and anecdotal experience? This is probably the most important question, and also the most complicated to answer definitively. The truth is that mainstream science still treats the subject with considerable skepticism. But that doesn't mean there aren't fascinating studies, experiments, and discoveries that are beginning to shed light on mechanisms that could explain how this communication works. Let's start with the work of one of the most famous researchers in this field, Rupert Sheldrake, a Cambridge-educated British biochemist who has dedicated decades of his career to studying phenomena that conventional science prefers to ignore. Sheldrake conducted extensive research on what he calls the morphic field, a kind of invisible information field that connects members of the same species and also members of close social groups, such as humans and their pets. In his most famous experiments, he documented thousands of cases of dogs that knew when their owners were coming home, even when those owners arrived at completely random and unpredictable times. He installed cameras in the participants' homes and timed exactly when the dogs began to demonstrate waiting behavior at the door or window, and the results were surprising. The animals began to position themselves in the waiting spot exactly when their owner made the mental decision to return home or began the return journey, even if this happened miles away and at completely unexpected times. How can this be explained through conventional scientific models? A highly developed sense of smell? Impossible, given the distance. Heightened hearing? Also impossible, for the same reasons. A predictable routine? No, because the experiments were specifically designed to eliminate any time pattern. Sheldrake's explanation involves a form of telepathic connection based on information fields that transcend the limitations of conventional physical space. But things get even more interesting when we look at other areas of science that are beginning to validate aspects of this intuitive communication. Modern neuroscience has discovered something absolutely fascinating about how the brains of humans and pets synchronize during interactions. Researchers at the University of Vienna conducted studies using simultaneous electroencephalograms on humans and their dogs during moments of affectionate interaction, and found that their brain waves begin to synchronize, oscillating at similar frequencies, especially in the theta and alpha bands, which are associated with states of relaxation, meditation, and deep emotional processing. This suggests that there is literally neural synchronization happening between you and your pet during moments of genuine connection. What's more, studies on mirror neurons, the brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe another being performing the same action, have shown that these neurons not only function between humans, but are also activated when we interact with animals with whom we have strong emotional bonds. This means your brain is literally mirroring your pet's emotional and even physical states in real time, creating a kind of empathic resonance that could be the neurological basis for what we interpret as telepathic communication. You're not just imagining that you feel what your dog feels. You're literally feeling it through a sophisticated neural mechanism of empathy that has evolved over millions of years to facilitate deep social connections. Quantum physics has also entered this conversation in a way that has many people's hair standing on end. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where two particles can remain connected in such a way that a change in the state of one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance separating them, has led some theoretical physicists to speculate about the possibility of quantum entanglement in complex biological systems, including brains. While this remains an extremely speculative and controversial area within physics, researchers such as Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed that quantum processes in the microtubules of neurons could be fundamental to consciousness and to phenomena not yet fully explained, including intuition and possible non-local communication between nervous systems. Obviously, this is still far from scientific consensus, but the point is that there are plausible theoretical pathways within physics itself that could eventually explain instantaneous communication of information between emotionally connected brains, as would be the case between you and your pet. Now let's talk about something you've probably experienced, but never quite figured out. Those moments when you just know something about your pet for no logical reason. You're at work and suddenly have a strong feeling that you need to go home because your cat isn't well, only to discover that your cat was actually sick or scared. Or you feel an inexplicable urge to take your dog's leash for a walk at a completely unusual time, only to discover that your pet really needed to go out, perhaps for urgent intestinal issues. Or even that strange feeling that your pet wants something specific, not food or water, but something different. And when you follow that intuition, you discover you've hit the nail on the head. Professional animal communicators, those who work specifically providing telepathic readings of pets for their owners, say that these everyday experiences are actually mini episodes of telepathic communication happening spontaneously. The difference between these random experiences and intentional, developed telepathic communication is that in the latter, you learn to quiet your conscious mind enough to open a consistent, clear channel for receiving this information, rather than just catching occasional glimpses when the message is so strong that it penetrates through the constant mental noise that characterizes most people's default state of mind. But here's a question many people ask that we need to address with brutal honesty. Isn't all of this just confirmation bias, psychological projection, and magical thinking? Aren't people simply seeing patterns where none exist, interpreting normal animal behaviors as mystical messages, and essentially talking to themselves while believing they're talking to their pets? This is an absolutely valid criticism, and one that any rational person should seriously consider before fully embracing the idea of animal telepathic communication. The uncomfortable truth is that yes, there is certainly a lot of this going on out there. There are people who project their own emotions, desires, and fears onto their animals and interpret this as telepathic communication. There are charlatan animal communicators who use cold reading techniques, the same ones employed by fake mediums and psychics, to give the impression that they're receiving information from the animal when in fact they're just making educated guesses based on body language, species-typical behavior, and information the owner unconsciously provides. There is a whole market of overpriced courses promising to teach animal telepathic communication in a weekend, when the reality is that developing this skill genuinely and reliably requires years of practice, deep self-knowledge, and brutal intellectual honesty with oneself to distinguish between genuine messages and personal projections. But recognizing that fraud and self-deception exist in this area doesn't automatically invalidate all the genuine experiences millions of people around the world report having with their animals. It would be like saying that because there are bad restaurants, cooking as an art doesn't exist. The real challenge lies in developing the discernment to separate the wheat from the chaff, to distinguish between genuine experiences of deep intuitive connection and egoic projections disguised as mystical communication. And here's something important that serious practitioners of this art always emphasize. True telepathic communication with animals is never about inflating the human ego, never about feeling special or enlightened, never about proving anything to anyone. It's about developing enough humility to truly listen to a being whose way of perceiving and processing reality is fundamentally different from your own. It's about expanding your capacity for empathy beyond the barriers of verbal language, and about recognizing that consciousness and subjectivity exist in forms and expressions far beyond the human model we've learned to consider the only valid one. So how the heck would you even begin to develop this skill if you decided to try? Here's where it gets practical, and many people discover that it's much more difficult than they imagined because it requires something most people simply don't have: genuine mental silence. Not the 5-second silence you achieve when you're trying to meditate for the first time and are proud of yourself for not thinking about anything for a few moments. We're talking about a deep, sustained silence, where you can truly empty your mind of expectations, judgments, projections, and the incessant mental chatter that normally dominates your consciousness. Why is this so important? Because telepathic communication works like a radio. If you're constantly broadcasting your own thoughts, fears, expectations, and interpretations, you simply can't clearly receive the transmission coming from another source. It's like trying to listen to a radio station while you're shouting into the microphone. Impossible to pick up any external signal through all the internal noise you're creating. The basic process taught by most professional animal communicators begins with something surprisingly simple but incredibly difficult to execute. Sitting quietly with your animal, with no expectations, no agenda, no looking at your phone or the TV on in the background, just you and the animal sharing space and presence. Many people can't do this for more than 30 seconds without becoming anxious, bored, or starting to think about the 1,000 things they need to do. But it is precisely in this space of quiet, still presence that communication can begin to happen. The next step involves actively quieting your mind through meditation techniques, conscious breathing, or any practice that works to bring you into a state of alert relaxation. That state where you are simultaneously relaxed, but mentally present and receptive. In this state, you then direct your attention to the animal, but not with an intense, focused attention that creates tension, but with a soft, open, receptive attention, as if you were creating an empty mental space where information could emerge. Some communicators suggest visualizing a light or energy channel connecting your heart to the animal's heart, creating a bridge between you. And then you wait. And here's the part that frustrates absolutely everyone at first. You can't force, you can't demand, you can't get impatient. You simply maintain this state of receptive openness and observe what arises in your awareness without judgment. Sudden mental images may arise, which are often different from the images you normally create when you're consciously imagining something. They tend to appear spontaneously with specific visual qualities. Physical sensations may arise in your body that weren't there moments ago. Perhaps an ache somewhere the animal is feeling, or a sense of discomfort or contentment that doesn't originate with you. Emotions may arise that are clearly not your own, emotions that you recognize as foreign to your current emotional state, but that makes sense as expressions of what the animal might be feeling. Sudden thoughts or insights about something the animal wants or needs may arise, information that appears complete in your mind without you having gone through a logical process of deduction. And here's the trick. You need to trust these subtle first impressions without immediately dismissing them as your imagination, but also without getting so attached to them that you start crafting and creating stories from a tiny fragment of real information. Validation is crucial in this learning process because without some way to confirm whether what you're receiving is accurate or just a mental projection, you can't reliably develop the skill. This means testing the impressions you receive in practical ways. If you get the impression that your dog wants something specific, test it by offering it and observe the reaction. If you sense that your cat is in pain somewhere, take it to the vet and see if your impression was well-founded. If you receive a mental image of something the animal wants to do or somewhere it wants to go, test it by following that intuition and observe if the animal responds in a way that confirms your perception. Over time, through lots of practice and brutal honesty with yourself about what's right, wrong, coincidence, or projection, you begin to develop a more refined sense of how genuine communication feels different from when you're just talking to yourself. But what about professional animal communicators? Those people who claim to be able to telepathically read animals even from a distance, sometimes from the other side of the planet, with just a photo and the pet's name. Does it really work, or is it all a scam? Here we enter even more controversial territory that's difficult to objectively evaluate. There are thousands of people around the world offering professional animal communication services, charging from modest to absurd amounts for sessions where they claim to telepathically communicate with your pet and convey messages, reveal health issues, explain difficult behaviors, find lost animals, and even facilitate conversations between deceased pets and their grieving owners. Some of these people are undoubtedly charlatans, preying on the emotional vulnerability of owners who deeply love their animals and are desperate for answers, connection, or comfort. They use manipulative techniques, make claims vague enough to apply to almost any situation, fish for information from clients through seemingly innocent questions, and basically deliver what they know the client wants to hear. But there are also animal communicators whose accuracy and specificity of information simply cannot be explained by conventional methods of deduction or cold reading. These professionals provide specific details about the animal's history, past traumas unknown to the current owner but later confirmed, accurate descriptions of the environments the animal lived in before being adopted, information about health problems that veterinarians later confirm, and even the location of lost animals with a success rate that goes far beyond statistical chance. Documenting and verifying these cases in a rigorous, scientific manner is extremely difficult because there are so many variables, so much room for information contamination, and so much subjectivity involved in interpreting the results. But the volume of reports from people who have had transformative and evidentiary experiences with genuine animal communicators is too great to simply be dismissed as coincidence or universal fraud. A particularly interesting and moving aspect of this practice is when communicators work with rescued animals who have severe trauma or problematic behaviors that no one can understand or resolve through conventional training methods. There are documented cases of dogs with unexplained aggression who, through telepathic communication sessions, revealed specific traumas from previous abuse, allowing the owner and trainers to develop specific therapeutic approaches that led to dramatic behavioral transformations. There are also cats with destructive or inappropriate elimination behaviors who, according to communicators, explain their reasons as related to changes in the environment, family dynamics, or even sensitivity to specific energies in the home, and when these issues were addressed, the problematic behavior ceased. Horses with performance or relationship problems with riders who, through telepathic communication, expressed physical pain in specific locations, discomfort with equipment or training techniques, or even preferences regarding who should ride them, leading to adjustments that resulted in dramatic improvements. But there's an even deeper and more emotionally charged layer to this whole story that we need to address. Communication with animals who are dying or have already died. Many animal communicators offer communication services during the euthanasia process to help owners understand whether their pet is ready to go, if there's anything they want to communicate before passing, or if they have any fears or concerns about the process. These are situations of extreme emotional vulnerability, where the potential for exploitation is enormous, but also where many people report experiences of genuine comfort, peace, and closure that have helped immensely in the grieving process. Communication with deceased animals, where grieving owners seek communicators to try to connect with their departed pets, is even more controversial because it enters territory that mixes animal communication with mediumship, something that the overwhelming majority of scientists completely reject as illusion or fraud. However, anyone who has lost a beloved animal knows the excruciating pain of grief. And if a session with an animal communicator brings genuine comfort, aids the healing process, and allows the person to find peace, is there value in that, regardless of whether or not we believe in the metaphysical validity of what is happening? This is a complex question that blends compassionate pragmatism with intellectual integrity, and there are no easy answers. There is also a cultural and spiritual aspect to animal communication that cannot be ignored if we are to fully understand this phenomenon. In shamanic traditions around the world, communicating with animals, both physical and spiritual, is a fundamental part of spiritual practice and healing work. Shamans traditionally served as intermediaries between the human world and the natural world, including the animal kingdom, and much of their power and knowledge came from this ability to communicate with and receive teachings from animal spirits and physical animals. In Hinduism and Buddhism, there is a strong emphasis on the interconnectedness of all sentient life and the capacity of all beings to experience suffering and joy, creating a philosophical basis for considering animals as conscious subjects with whom deep communication is not only possible, but ethically necessary. Native American traditions have extensive teachings about animals as teachers, guides, and bearers of specific medicines, with ritual practices dedicated to honoring, learning from, and communicating with the animal world. Even within mystical Christianity and some Catholic traditions, there are saints known specifically for their ability to communicate with animals, such as Saint Francis of Assisi. The point here is not to argue that because something exists in ancient spiritual traditions, this automatically validates its objective reality, but rather to recognize that intuitive and profound communication with animals is a universal human phenomenon that transcends cultures, historical periods, and specific belief systems. This suggests that there may be something fundamental in the human experience and the human-animal relationship that these practices are tapping into, even if we do not yet have adequate scientific frameworks to fully explain the mechanisms involved. Perhaps the question is not so much, is this real or not real in the binary sense that our modern scientific culture demands, but rather, what does this experience reveal about consciousness, connection, empathy, and the as yet uncharted capacities of the human mind? Now let's talk about something that really makes skeptics' hair stand on end, and that even people open to the idea of animal telepathic communication have trouble swallowing. Claims that animals can communicate complex, information about philosophy, spirituality, their past lives, soul purposes, and spiritual missions they have with their humans. Some animal communicators report that during sessions, animals not only communicate their basic physical and emotional needs, but also engage in deep discussions about the nature of reality, share sophisticated spiritual teachings, discuss their soul choices before incarnating, explain spiritual contracts they made with their humans, and even offer advice on the owner's spiritual path. For many people, this goes too far, sounding more like the communicator projecting their own spiritual beliefs and philosophies through the animal as metaphysical ventriloquism than genuine communication. And this criticism has substance, because it's very convenient that these animals supposedly always share spiritual philosophies that align perfectly with the communicator's own belief system, be it New Age, Buddhist, mystical Christian, or any other tradition. On the other hand, if we assume that consciousness and intelligence exist across a much broader spectrum than we conventionally recognize, And if animals possess some level of consciousness and subjectivity that transcends their cognitive capacities measurable through behavioral tests, then who are we to place rigid limits on what they can and cannot know or communicate? Human arrogance has historically underestimated the capabilities of other life forms. For centuries, we believed that animals were automatons without emotions or thoughts, and now we know that this is absurdly false. We believed that only humans used tools until we observed multiple species doing so. We believed that only humans had culture and cultural transmission of knowledge until we discovered this in whales, primates, crows, and others. We believed that only humans had self-awareness until the mirror test revealed it in dolphins, elephants, pigeons, and other species. Each time science delves deeper into the study of animal cognition, it discovers levels of sophistication that we previously thought impossible. So perhaps it is premature for us to be certain that animals could not access or communicate information of a more abstract or spiritual nature. A related phenomenon worth mentioning is the case of animals that appear to demonstrate foreknowledge of future events or sensitivity to dimensions of reality that humans normally do not perceive. There are numerous reports of animals acting strangely, hours or days before earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and other natural disasters, leaving areas before the event occurs or showing obvious signs of agitation and fear when there is still no human perceived sign of the impending disaster. While this could be explained by heightened sensitivity to subtle seismic vibrations or other environmental changes that precede these events, there are also more difficult to explain reports of animals reacting to events that have no obvious physical precursors. Dogs refusing to enter vehicles that later become involved in fatal accidents. Cats abandoning established routines to be near family members who later discover they have serious illnesses. Horses refusing to enter trailers or cross bridges that later collapse. These reports fall into a category that science calls anecdotal, personal stories that have not been verified under controlled conditions and therefore cannot be used as solid scientific evidence. But the sheer number of similar reports from different cultures, different historical periods, and people with no obvious motive for fabricating these stories is intriguing, to say the least. Are these cases of genuine animal precognition or simply confirmation bias, where we remember the rare instances where an animal's strange behavior preceded something significant and forget the hundreds of times the animal acted strangely and nothing happened? Probably a combination of both. But again, dismissing all these reports as coincidence or misinterpretation may be as premature as accepting them all as proof of paranormal abilities. Let's now address a practical aspect that's of great interest to people considering exploring telepathic communication with their pets. What can you realistically hope to achieve with this, and what are the limits? If your expectations are that you'll sit with your dog and have a fluent verbal conversation, as if you were talking to another human, where you ask complex questions and receive articulate answers in complete sentences with perfect grammar, You'll be disappointed because that's not. Typically, how the experience manifests. Animal telepathic communication operates much more on the level of impressions, images, sensations, and intuitive knowing than in structured verbal language. You might receive a sense that your pet is happy or sad, but perhaps not an elaborate explanation in words as to why. You might receive a mental image of something the animal wants, but not necessarily a complete dissertation on its deep motivations. That said, many communicators report that with time and practice, communication can become surprisingly specific and detailed, while still maintaining this fundamental nonverbal quality. Instead of hearing words, you may begin to receive sequences of images that tell a story, or layered emotional impressions that reveal sophisticated nuances of the animal's internal state, or that kind of direct knowing where you simply know something about the animal with complete certainty without being able to explain how you arrived at that conclusion. The experience varies enormously from person to person and from animal to animal, depending on the level of emotional bond already established, the openness and natural telepathic ability of both human and animal, the time devoted to practicing and developing the skill, and more mysterious factors that no one truly understands. One thing that surprises many people when they begin exploring telepathic communication with their pets is discovering that communication isn't just about humans transmitting questions and animals responding, but that animals also actively initiate communication. Many practitioners report that after opening this channel more consciously and intentionally, their animals begin sending messages, requests, complaints, and even unsolicited opinions about various aspects of domestic life. Your cat may start making it very clear that he hates that new food you bought, thinking it would be an improvement, but which to him has a disgusting texture or taste. Your dog may communicate specific preferences about walking times, preferred routes. Other dogs he likes or dislikes meeting at the park. Assertive animals may even begin to question decisions you're making about home remodeling, the arrival of new members to the human or animal family, or routine changes that directly affect them. This can be simultaneously wonderful because it tremendously deepens connection and mutual understanding, but it can also be challenging when you discover that your animal has strong opinions about things you can't or won't change. There's also the delicate issue of when information received through telepathic communication contradicts veterinary assessments, or other established knowledge about the animal. For example, you have a session with an animal communicator who tells you that your dog is experiencing severe pain in his right hip and needs urgent treatment. But your veterinarian recently examined him and said everything is fine. What do you do? Or you receive a strong telepathic impression that your cat needs a completely different diet than the one prescribed by the veterinary specialist for his kidney condition. How do you navigate these conflicts? The responsible response is to always prioritize professional veterinary evaluation and never substitute appropriate medical care for telepathic impressions, no matter how strong or convincing they seem. At the same time, persistent telepathic impressions may warrant seeking a second veterinary opinion or further investigation, especially since veterinary medicine, like human medicine, is not infallible, and diagnoses can be missed. Which brings us to another crucial point that anyone exploring animal telepathic communication needs to understand. This practice should complement, never replace, appropriate veterinary care, adequate socialization, behavioral training when necessary, proper nutrition, and all other fundamental aspects of animal welfare. Telepathic communication isn't a magic bullet that solves all your pet's problems or relieves you of your basic responsibilities as a pet owner. A dog with severe separation anxiety likely needs a structured behavior modification plan, possibly medication if prescribed by a veterinarian, and specific environmental changes, not just telepathic communication sessions where you explain to them that you need to go to work. An obese cat needs calorie control and environmental enrichment that promotes physical activity, not just you telepathically telling them to eat less and exercise more. Telepathic communication can definitely help you better understand the emotional roots of problematic behaviors. It can reveal specific traumas or fears that need to be addressed. It can facilitate the process of introducing necessary changes in a less stressful way for the animal. But it is no substitute for practical interventions based on scientific knowledge about animal behavior and physiology. There's also an entire ethical dimension to animal telepathic communication that needs to be seriously considered. If you develop the ability to access your animal's deepest thoughts, feelings, and desires, you have a heightened moral responsibility to honor what you discover within the limits of what is reasonable and possible. If you discover through telepathic communication that your dog is deeply unhappy being left alone for 10 hours every day while you work, you have an ethical obligation to try to find solutions, whether that means hiring a dog walker, arranging doggy daycare, adjusting your work schedule, or finding other ways to mitigate the suffering you now know for sure is occurring. Ignoring information you've obtained telepathically about your animal's suffering or unmet needs, because doing so would be inconvenient, is a form of betrayal of the trust implicit in this telepathic connection you've established. On the other hand, there's also the risk of becoming overly anxious and hypervigilant about every small emotional fluctuation or minor discomfort you perceive in your animal through telepathic communication. Animals, like humans, experience a normal spectrum of emotions that include occasionally being bored, mildly frustrated, a little uncomfortable, or momentarily sad, without this constituting a crisis requiring immediate intervention. Developing telepathic communication doesn't mean you need to become a neurotic servant dedicated to ensuring your animal is in a state of transcendent bliss 24/7. Means developing heightened sensitivity that allows you to identify when something is genuinely wrong versus normal fluctuations and respond appropriately to real needs without falling into dysfunctional codependency disguised as deep spiritual communication. Let's now talk about something that many people who explore animal telepathic communication eventually encounter, and which can be quite disturbing: discovering that your pet is aware of things about you that you'd prefer to keep private. If telepathic communication is a two-way channel of information exchange, then your pet is not only sending information to you, but also receiving information from you, including thoughts, emotions, and aspects of your inner life that you don't share verbally with anyone. Multiple animal communicators report that animals often demonstrate surprisingly accurate and detailed knowledge about their humans' emotional lives, relationships, work situations, health problems, and even private thoughts. Your dog may know about that nasty argument you had with your partner, even if it happened far from home, not because he heard it, but because he sensed your emotional state and possibly even accessed mental images of the situation. Your cat may be perfectly aware that you're considering ending your relationship or changing jobs, even if you haven't said a word about it out loud. Does this mean you don't have mental privacy from your animal? Well, that depends on how developed the specific animal's telepathic sensitivity is, how open the communication channel is between you, and how intense the emotions or thoughts involved are, since emotions and thoughts charged with intense energy are apparently much easier to pick up telepathically than neutral or abstract reflections. For some people, this is comforting because it means you have a companion who truly knows and accepts you completely, including the parts of you you hide from the world. For others, it can be uncomfortable or even invasive to feel that even your private thoughts are being accessed. But here's the thing. If animal telepathic communication is real, then it's probably already happening on some level, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. The only difference is that when you develop your own telepathic sensitivity, you become aware of an exchange of information that has been occurring all along, behind the scenes of your ordinary consciousness. Another fascinating and little discussed aspect is how telepathic communication can shift the power dynamics between humans and animals in ways that aren't always comfortable for humans. Traditionally, humans hold a position of absolute authority over pets, making all decisions about their lives, including where they live, what they eat, when they go out, who they interact with, and even when they die. But when you open a channel of genuine telepathic communication, you are essentially elevating the animal to the status of a subject with agency, preferences, opinions, and even the right to be consulted on decisions that affect its life. This can create uncomfortable situations where what you discover the animal wants contradicts what you want or have planned. You want to move to a smaller apartment in another city for career reasons, but your dog clearly communicates that he loves his current house with a yard and doesn't want to move. You want to adopt a second cat to keep your current cat company. But when you communicate this intention telepathically, he makes it absolutely clear that he prefers to be an only child, and the arrival of another cat would be experienced as a betrayal and an invasion of his territory. How do you navigate these situations ethically? Do you have an obligation to always prioritize the animal's communicated desires, even when they directly conflict with legitimate human needs or desires? Probably not in absolute terms, because that would be unsustainable, but you at least have an obligation to seriously weigh the animal's preferences, communicate honestly about the reasons why you need to do something they don't want to do, and seek compromises or ways to mitigate the negative. Impact when unwanted changes are unavoidable. This is one reason why animal telepathic communication is not just a technical skill, but a profound ethical commitment that requires emotional and moral maturity to be practiced with integrity. Let's now explore some of the most sophisticated and challenging criticisms of the idea of animal telepathic communication, because any thinking person needs to consider these arguments seriously before forming definitive conclusions on the subject. One of the most potent criticisms comes from cognitive neuroscience and has to do with what we know about how language and conceptual thought function in the human brain versus in animal brains. symbolic language, the ability to form abstract concepts, propositional reasoning, and second-order reflective awareness of one's own thoughts. These are all capacities that appear to depend on specific, highly developed brain structures in humans, particularly the prefrontal cortex and specialized language areas. Non-human animals, even the most intelligent, such as great apes, dolphins, and crows, lack these structures to the same degree of development. So how could they formulate and communicate thoughts in the form of complex propositional sentences or sophisticated abstract concepts if they lack the neural machinery necessary to process information in this way? The answer from telepathic communication practitioners is usually that communication doesn't occur through propositional language, but through images, sensations, emotions, and more direct forms of knowledge that don't require linguistic processing. But even this faces challenges, because translating non-linguistic experiences into human language necessarily involves a tremendous amount of interpretation, elaboration, and potential distortion on the part of the human receiver. When an animal communicator says that the dog communicated that it feels emotionally neglected because the owner is spending more time with the family's new baby, did the dog actually formulate this thought in terms of concepts like emotional neglect, or did the communicator actually capture a vague sense of sadness and loneliness from the dog and then narratively elaborate this raw feeling into a psychologically sophisticated explanation using human conceptual categories? The line between genuine reception of telepathic communication and elaborate interpretation of basic emotional signals is extremely difficult to draw precisely, and likely much of what is presented as telepathic communication actually falls more into the latter camp than practitioners would like to admit. Another important criticism comes from evolutionary psychology and questions why, if telepathic communication is a real ability possessed by humans and animals, it wouldn't have been more strongly selected for evolutionarily. If our ancestors could communicate telepathically with the animals they hunted or defended themselves against, this would have provided such a great adaptive advantage that one would expect this ability to be universal and robust in the human population. But it clearly isn't. If animals could reliably communicate telepathically with each other and with humans, one would expect to see clear evidence of this in ethological studies of animal behavior in natural settings, but scientifically observed animal communication is explainable through vocalizations, body language, chemicals like pheromones, and other conventional sensory signals without the need to invoke telepathy. Practitioners sometimes respond that telepathic ability exists but has been culturally suppressed, or that it requires specific conditions of deep emotional bonding that don't exist in evolutionary contexts of predation, but these answers don't fully explain the ability's apparent rarity. There's also the fundamental methodological problem of how you would test animal telepathic communication in a way that eliminates all possible alternative explanations. Any experiment needs to control for subtle body language reading, cold reading, information previously acquired about the animal through conventional means, sensory cues that humans may not consciously detect, but that animals clearly detect, statistical patterns in the lives and behavior of animals of a given species that allow for accurate, educated guesses, and a dozen other confounding variables. Designing an experimental protocol that truly tests pure telepathy in isolation from all these factors is extraordinarily difficult, and the few studies that have attempted to do so have produced mixed results that were not convincing enough to gain mainstream acceptance in the scientific community. But here's something interesting. The absence of definitive proof is not proof of absence. The fact that we still don't have incontrovertible scientific evidence of animal telepathic communication doesn't mean it definitely doesn't exist. It just means that if it does exist, it's sufficiently subtle, inconsistent, or dependent on as yet unidentified variables that it eludes current methods of scientific investigation. The history of science is littered with phenomena that were considered impossible or folklore until the appropriate instruments and theoretical frameworks were developed to detect and understand them. Meteorites were considered peasant superstition by French academia in the 18th century, until incontrovertible evidence forced a change of perspective. Atmospheric fireballs were denied for decades by the scientific community until they were unequivocally photographed. The very idea that invisible waves could carry information through empty space would have sounded like magic to people before the discovery of electromagnetic waves. So where does all this leave us? After exploring the history, claims, evidence, practices, criticisms, and all the nuances of this complex phenomenon, what can we reasonably conclude about telepathic communication with pets? The honest answer is that we're dealing with something that exists in a fascinating gray area between genuine subjective experience and verifiable objective explanations. Is there something real going on when people report telepathic communication with their animals? Almost certainly, yes, in the sense that they are having genuine subjective experiences of deep connection, reception of information seemingly coming from the animal, and sometimes surprising accuracy in perceiving internal states, needs, and even events in the animal's life. Does this mean that there is a literal transfer of information occurring through some non-physical channel, or one not understood by current science? Possibly, but it has not yet been conclusively demonstrated under rigorously controlled conditions in a way that would convince the mainstream scientific community. Does it mean that much of what is interpreted as telepathic communication is actually extremely sophisticated reading of subtle body language, behavioral patterns, chemical signals below conscious awareness, and the interpretative elaboration of basic emotional impressions? Certainly a significant percentage probably fall into this category. But even if much of the phenomenon is explainable through deep empathy, keen observation, and heightened sensitivity to subtle cues rather than literal telepathy, it is still of immense value. The ability to tune in so deeply with another sentient being that you can perceive their needs, emotions, and internal states with remarkable accuracy is extraordinary, regardless of the exact mechanism through which it occurs. If practicing animal telepathic communication techniques deepens the bond between you and your pet, increases your sensitivity to their needs, improves their well-being, and enriches the experience for both of you, then it has real pragmatic value, even if we never obtain definitive scientific validation of the proposed mechanisms. The experience of deep connection with an animal you love has intrinsic value that does not depend on being explicable through current scientific paradigms to be legitimate and transformative. What seems clear is that animals are far more conscious, sensitive, and perceptive than historical models acknowledged, and that the connection between humans and their companion animals operates on emotional and even potentially telepathic dimensions that go far beyond simple conditioning and response to commands. Whether you call it telepathic communication, intuitive communication, energetic connection, deep attunement, or simply profound interspecies love, there is something real and precious happening in the relationship between humans and their pets that deserves to be honored, explored, and cultivated. Scientific research will continue to investigate the mechanisms. Practitioners will continue to develop and refine techniques. Skeptics will continue to demand more rigorous evidence. And millions of people around the world will continue to have profound experiences of connection with their animals that feel like genuine communication, regardless of what official science eventually concludes. If you're considering exploring telepathic communication with your own pet, here's my final advice. Approach it with an open but critical mind, genuine curiosity, but without rigid expectations about how the experience should manifest. A willingness to practice consistently because this isn't something you master in an afternoon, and brutal honesty with yourself to distinguish between genuine impressions and egoic projections. Don't spend a fortune on expensive animal communicators promising miracles, but also don't automatically dismiss all subjective experiences just because they don't fit neatly into current scientific paradigms. Always keep your pet's physical well-being your #1 priority, never substituting telepathic impressions for proper veterinary care. And remember that the ultimate goal isn't to develop mystical superpowers to impress people, but to deepen your connection with a being you love and who depends on you for their complete well-being. The truth is, it doesn't matter whether telepathic communication with pets works exactly as its most enthusiastic proponents claim, or whether it's a more mundane phenomenon of heightened empathic sensitivity romanticized with mystical language. What matters is that you can definitely develop a deeper connection with your animal, you can learn to read their needs more accurately, you can create a richer and more satisfying bond for both of you, and you can experience moments of interspecies communion that will touch your heart in ways that will permanently transform how you view animals and their place in the natural world. This journey is worth exploring regardless of where you ultimately fall on the spectrum of belief about the exact mechanisms involved. Now I want to hear from you, because your experience and perspective are valuable in this ongoing conversation. Have you ever had experiences that felt like telepathic communication with your pet? Moments where you simply knew something about your pet without logical explanation? Situations where your pet seemed to demonstrate knowledge of something that should be impossible for them to know? Or are you completely skeptical about all this and think it's romantic self-deception? Leave a comment below sharing your experiences, your doubts, your stories about that inexplicable moment with your pet that you've never been able to get out of your head. And if this content made you think differently about your pet, if it brought insights you hadn't considered before, or if you simply found this in-depth exploration of a controversial but fascinating topic interesting, please like it because it helps more people find this content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos where we continue exploring the mysteries of the human-animal relationship, animal behavior, consciousness, and all these fascinating questions at the border of science, spirituality, and lived experience. Your engagement truly makes a difference and allows us to continue producing in-depth content on topics that deserve to be explored seriously, but also with an open mind. Until the next video, may you and your pet experience moments of deep connection, however you choose to name or understand these precious moments. Let's dive even deeper into specific practical aspects of telepathic communication with animals that will make this all much more tangible and applicable for those who truly want to explore this possibility. One of the most fascinating things that few people discuss is how different animal species seem to have completely distinct telepathic communication styles, almost as if each species had its own dialect or preferred frequency of information transmission. Experienced animal communicators who work with multiple species consistently report that communicating telepathically with a dog is a fundamentally different experience than communicating with a cat, which in turn is different from communicating with horses, which are different from communicating with birds, which are different from communicating with reptiles, and so on. Understanding these differences can make all the difference between succeeding in your communication attempts or becoming frustrated, thinking you're doing everything wrong when in fact you were just trying to communicate with your cat using an approach that works best for dogs. Dogs, according to consistent reports from multiple communicators, tend to be the most enthusiastic, direct, and emotionally transparent telepathic communicators. When a dog wants to communicate something, they generally have no filters, no sophisticated hidden agendas, and no complex psychological games. Canine communication tends to come in waves of pure, intense emotion, accompanied by relatively simple and direct mental images. If a dog is happy, you feel a burst of radiant joy that is almost impossible to misinterpret. If they are anxious about something, you get a sense of urgent unease, often accompanied by images of the cause of the anxiety, be it the arrival of strangers, a frightening noise, or the absence of their owner. Dogs also tend to be the most receptive and responsive when you initiate telepathic communication with them, almost as if they have always been eagerly awaiting this deeper connection and are absolutely delighted when they finally realize you are attempting to communicate telepathically. quality of canine communication is often described as childlike in the best sense, not because of a lack of depth, but because of a quality of unarmed emotional honesty and open vulnerability that young children have before they learn all the layers of defenses and social masks that adults carry. Cats, on the other hand, are a completely different story, and anyone who has shared a life with cats won't be surprised by this. Feline telepathic communication tends to be more subtle, more layered, more ambiguous, and sometimes deliberately cryptic. Where dogs are like someone happily shouting at you from across the room, cats are like someone whispering something important but purposefully ambiguous in your ear and then leaving you to figure out exactly what they meant. Communicators report that cats often seem to be testing you, assessing whether you're worthy of receiving their deeper communications before they actually open up. The mental images that come from cats tend to be more impressionistic, more atmospheric, more charged with subtle sensations than clear narratives. A cat may communicate displeasure with something through a general sense of sophisticated disapproval rather than a specific, direct complaint. Cats also seem to have firmer boundaries about when and how they are willing to engage in telepathic communication. You can't just decide that now is the time to talk telepathically to your cat and expect him to cooperate. He will engage when he decides he wants to and not before, perfectly honoring the feline reputation for independence and self-determination. Horses represent another completely unique style of telepathic communication that surprises many with its philosophical depth and apparent wisdom. Animal communicators who work extensively with horses often speak of these animals with a special kind of reverence, describing them as highly sensitive beings, not only emotionally but energetically, capable of reading human energy fields with extraordinary accuracy, and often serving as powerful emotional mirrors for the humans around them. Equine telepathic communication tends to come through very strong bodily sensations, since horses are so physical and so attuned to body language and spatial positioning. You might receive information from a horse through a sudden feeling of tension in a certain part of your own body, reflecting discomfort the horse is feeling, or a physical impression of wanting to move in a certain direction, or changes in your own posture that reflect the horse's emotional state. Horses also seem to communicate more frequently about relational dynamics, about the quality of the connection between them and their humans, about trust or lack thereof, about mutual respect, themes that seem to be absolutely central to equine consciousness in a way that goes beyond what we observe in other species. Birds, especially parrots and other highly intelligent species, have a telepathic communication style that many describe as rapid, sharp, and sometimes even frenetic, reflecting the creature's accelerated metabolism and nervous energy. Communicators report that receiving messages from birds can be like trying to read something that's rapidly flashing across your consciousness, requiring a different kind of focused attention to capture the transmissions before they fade away. Birds also appear to be surprisingly sophisticated telepathic communicators when it comes to visual information, sending extremely detailed and vivid mental images, which makes sense for creatures whose survival depends so heavily on acute visual processing. Parrots, in particular, are reported to have very strong telepathic personalities, sometimes opinionated, sometimes sarcastic, often more psychologically complex than many would assume possible for a bird, reflecting the remarkable intelligence of these species, which demonstrate cognitive capabilities rivaling or even exceeding great apes in certain domains. Reptiles pose arguably the greatest challenge for human telepathic communicators because their way of processing information and experiencing reality is so radically different from ours that establishing common ground for communication requires dramatically expanding your assumptions about how consciousness might work. Communicators who work with reptiles report that the quality of communication is much more primitive, much more based on immediate sensations and basic impulses, much less charged with complex emotion in the mammalian sense. A reptile communicating telepathically can convey information about heat, cold, hunger, the presence of a threat, territoriality, but rarely the kind of narrative emotional elaboration you might receive from mammals. This doesn't mean reptiles lack consciousness or aren't worthy of telepathic communication efforts, but it does mean you need to adjust your expectations and methodology to meet these beings where they are rather than projecting onto them mammalian ways of experiencing and communicating reality. Now let's dive into specific practical exercises you can start implementing immediately if you want to develop your telepathic communication skills with your own pet. The first and most fundamental exercise is what communicators call the practice of silent presence. This involves simply sitting near your animal without doing anything, with no agenda, no expectations, just sharing space in a state of relaxation and openness. It sounds absurdly simple, but most people quickly discover how challenging it is in practice. Make a commitment to do this for at least 15 minutes daily initially, then expanding to 30 minutes or more as you develop the ability to sustain this state. During this time, you are not trying to force communication, you are not mentally asking questions, you are not actively making an effort. You are simply being present and observing what naturally arises in your awareness. to any mental images that appear spontaneously, any physical sensations you didn't have before sitting, any emotions that don't seem to be your own, any sudden impulse to do or say something. Don't judge, don't analyze, just observe and mentally take note of these experiences. The second exercise involves practicing sending simple telepathic messages to your pet and observing for any behavioral response. Choose a time when your pet is relaxed but awake and you have privacy, so you don't feel self-conscious. Enter a meditative state through deep breathing, bodily relaxation, and mental stillness. Then, instead of calling your pet verbally or using any physical signal, form a clear and stable mental image of what you want to communicate. If you want your dog to come to you, clearly visualize him getting up and walking toward you, while simultaneously conveying the emotion of desire for his presence and the clear intention that you would like him to come. Hold this image and intention firmly in your mind for 20 to 30 seconds and then release completely, returning to a state of receptive openness. Observe whether your pet demonstrates any response, remembering that the response may not be immediate or obvious. Do this exercise repeatedly over days and weeks with different simple messages and document your results honestly, including failures and successes, to begin identifying patterns of what works. A third extremely valuable exercise involves telepathically guessing simple choices your pet will make. For example, if your dog has two favorite toys, place both in front of him, but before he chooses which one to take, enter a meditative state, telepathically tune into him, and see if you receive any impressions about which toy he will choose. Or if your cat has two favorite sleeping spots in your house, when you notice him about to settle down for a nap, see if you can telepathically intuit which spot he will go to. Keep a statistical record of your hits versus misses. If you're consistently hitting above the expected statistical chance rate, 50% for choices between two options, this suggests you're actually picking up on something. If you're hitting at the same rate as chance, this doesn't necessarily mean you're not receiving telepathic information. It may mean you haven't yet learned to distinguish genuine impressions from mental hunches, but at least you have objective feedback to work with. A more advanced exercise involves what's called a telepathic body scan, where you intuitively try to detect if your pet is experiencing any physical discomfort or pain anywhere on their body. This is extremely useful pragmatically because it can alert you to health problems before they become behaviorally obvious. With your pet relaxed, enter a meditative state and then slowly move your attention mentally through their body, starting at the head and gradually moving down to their paws and tail. As you do this, pay attention to any sensations that arise in your own body. Any sensations of heat, cold, tension, discomfort, or pain that appear when your attention is on a particular area of their body. These sensations in your own body may be reflecting what the animal is feeling through the phenomenon of mirror neurons and empathic resonance discussed earlier. If you consistently experience uncomfortable sensations when focusing your attention on a particular area of your pet's body, consider this a signal to at least physically check that area and possibly consult a veterinarian if the impression is strong and persistent. Another powerful exercise is what communicators call image reception practice, where you mentally ask your animal to show you something meaningful from their perspective. Enter a deep meditative state, establish a clear telepathic connection with your pet, and then mentally pose an open-ended question like, "Show me what's most important to you right now," or "Show me how you see this space," or "Show me something you'd like me to know." Then enter a state of complete receptivity with no expectations about what kind of response will come. Images may begin to emerge spontaneously on your internal mental screen, and these images may be surprisingly different from what you consciously expect. You may receive a view of the world from the animal's height and perspective, which for a cat or small dog is radically different from the human perspective. You may receive images of something you didn't even know was meaningful to the animal. The key is to trust the first impressions that arrive before your analytical mind has time to edit them or dismiss them as imagination. One of the most challenging but potentially revealing exercises is attempting telepathic communication when you and your pet are physically separated. If you typically have a strong connection with your pet when you're in the same room, try establishing communication when you're away from home. At a specific predetermined time during the day while you're at work or out, take a few minutes to enter a meditative state, visualize your pet clearly, and try to send a specific message or receive impressions about what they're doing at that moment. If possible, have a pet camera at home that records your pet's actions so you can later verify whether your telepathic impressions about their behavior or state during that specific time were accurate. This eliminates many confounding variables, such as reading body language, and provides a more rigorous test of whether genuine telepathic communication is occurring. It's absolutely crucial throughout this developmental process to maintain what we might call compassionate skepticism or beginner's mind. This means simultaneously remaining open to the genuine possibility of telepathic communication, while maintaining enough objectivity to question your own experiences and interpretations. Keep a detailed journal of all your telepathic communication attempts, including perceived successes, obvious failures, ambiguous experiences, and anything else that seems significant. Document the date, time, your and the animal's emotional state, the environment, what you attempted to communicate or receive, the response or impression you received, and how you validated or could validate its accuracy. over the weeks and months, patterns will emerge that will help you understand when and under what conditions you tend to be most successful, what types of information you receive most clearly, and how your own emotional projections or expectations may be tainting the reception of genuine information. Let's now discuss some of the most extraordinary and well-documented cases of animal telepathic communication that defy conventional explanations and can serve as both inspiration and fodder for critical reflection. One of the most famous cases involves a dog named Nkisi, an African gray parrot who has been the subject of extensive studies by researchers interested in animal cognition and communication. What made Nkisi especially interesting was not only his extraordinary linguistic ability, with a vocabulary of nearly 1,000 words, but also reports and experiments that suggested he could read minds or anticipate his owner's intentions in ways that seemed to go beyond reading behavioral cues. In filmed experiments where the owner was in a separate room, viewing random images selected by a computer, Nkisi, in another room, frequently verbalized words related to the images the owner was seeing at the exact moment she saw them, at rates statistically significant above chance. When she saw an image of a flower, he said, "flower." When she saw an image of a person swimming, he said, "water." Skeptics point to possible methodological flaws and the potential for confirmation bias, but even considering these criticisms, the results were intriguing enough to earn publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Another fascinating case involves a dog named JT, extensively studied by Rupert Sheldrake mentioned earlier. JT consistently went to the window to wait for his owner approximately 10 minutes before she arrived home, even when she arrived at completely random times determined by researchers through surprise phone calls. Video cameras recording the dog throughout the day showed that he did not wait at the window generally, but specifically began exhibiting waiting behavior when his owner began her return journey home, sometimes many miles away. Experiments were designed to rule out explanations based on routine, specific vehicle sounds, or other sensory cues, and yet the pattern persisted. Sheldrake proposed that this evidenced a form of intention-based telepathic connection, where the dog was telepathically tuning into his owner's mental decision to return home, rather than responding to any physical sensory input. There are also dramatic cases of professional animal communicators locating lost pets through telepathically received information from the animals about their location. One of the most impressive stories involves a communicator named Amelia Kincaid, who worked with the family of a lost cat. providing extremely specific descriptions of where the cat was hiding based on images she claimed to be receiving telepathically from the animal. She described a specific wooden structure painted a certain color, specific fences, particular plants, and even the view the cat had from its hiding place, all provided without her having physically visited the neighborhood. The family followed these detailed instructions and found the cat exactly where and how she had described. Skeptics reasonably point out that for every success story we hear, there are probably dozens of failed attempts that go unpublicized, and that vague enough descriptions can fit multiple locations, allowing people to find what they are looking for through persistent searching rather than accurate telepathic guidance. But cases with a level of specificity that actually lead directly to the animal deserve at least serious consideration of possible mechanisms. One of the most emotionally powerful and controversial aspects of animal telepathic communication involves cases where owners receive messages from animals that are dying or have just died. There are numerous reports of people who had vivid dreams about their pets the night the animal died, even though they were unaware of the incident, or who felt a clear presence or communication from the animal at the time of death, even though they were physically distant. One particularly moving case involves a woman whose dog was being euthanized at the veterinarian's office while she was medically unable to be present. She reported that at the exact time scheduled for the procedure, she felt an overwhelming wave of love and a clear sense of the dog's presence around her, along with telepathic impressions that she interpreted as the dog saying goodbye and assuring her that all was well. Subsequent verification confirmed that the timing of her experience corresponded precisely with the euthanasia. These experiences can be explained as coincidence, subconscious knowledge of the time creating expectation that manifested as a mystical experience, or psychological projections serving as a coping mechanism for grief. But for the people who experience them, they often have an undeniable quality of reality that provides profound comfort during a devastating time. But we also need to speak honestly about the failures, the disappointments, and the cases that should have worked but didn't if telepathic communication were as consistent and reliable as its most enthusiastic proponents sometimes claim. There are stories of desperate owners paying fortunes to animal communicators to locate lost pets based on specific telepathic information that led to extensive and costly searches in completely wrong locations, while the animal was in a completely different place or had already been found by someone else. There are cases of people making medical decisions about euthanasia based on telepathic communication with the animal that supposedly expressed readiness to leave, only to later feel agonizing guilt, wondering if they projected their own feelings of exhaustion as caregivers and interpreted it as communication from the animal. There are situations where communicators provided information that seemed accurate and specific in the session, but that later verification revealed to be generic enough to apply to virtually any animal of that species, or based on clues inadvertently provided by the owner during the initial conversation. The reality is likely that animal telepathic communication, if it exists as a genuine phenomenon, is far less consistent, far more subtle, far more vulnerable to interference and contamination, and far more dependent on factors not yet understood than how it is often portrayed in popular books and weekend courses promising guaranteed mastery. This doesn't mean we should dismiss it completely, but it does mean we should approach it with humility about the limits of what we actually know and can reliably do. It means being extremely cautious about making important decisions based solely on telepathic impressions without corroboration from other sources of information. It means developing a tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty rather than seeking absolute certainty where it doesn't yet exist. And it means recognizing that even if you develop genuine telepathic sensitivity to your animal, you will still make mistakes, you will still misinterpret, you will still have doubts about whether what you are sensing is real or projected, and all of this is a normal part of the process rather than a sign of total failure. We've now reached a point where we need to synthesize everything we've explored and offer some final practical guidance on how to navigate this complex and controversial territory in a way that is simultaneously courageous in exploration and responsible in application. If you decide to explore telepathic communication with your pet, do so as a personal experiment rather than a crusade to prove or disprove something. Approach it with the same attitude you would when learning any new skill. Expect a learning curve, accept initial failures and frustrations, commit to consistent practice over time, and celebrate small successes along the way without the need for immediate dramatic results. Always prioritize your pet's physical and emotional well-being above your curiosity about mystical phenomena. If exploring telepathic communication is in any way creating anxiety for you or your pet, or interfering with proper basic care, then scale back or stop altogether. Seek out a community of other practitioners where you can share experiences, ask questions, and receive feedback from others who are also navigating this path. However, maintain critical discernment regarding any teaching or technique that is presented as the sole absolute truth or that requires a substantial financial investment before you have personal proof of its effectiveness. Some of the best resources on animal communication come from communicators who offer free or low-cost information based on a genuine desire to share knowledge rather than aggressively monetizing people's beliefs. If you decide to work with a professional animal communicator, do careful research, seek verifiable references and testimonials, and consider starting with a low-cost session to assess whether the person seems genuine before investing significant amounts. Above all, let this exploration deepen your appreciation, reverence, and ethical commitment to your pet's well-being, regardless of whether you eventually conclude that literal telepathic communication is occurring. The true gift of this kind of practice is not developing mystical superpowers, but cultivating presence, attention, sensitivity, and unconditional love in your relationship with another sentient being. Even if all you gain is an increased ability to read subtle body language and respond more appropriately to your pet's needs, that is already a tremendous gain that will significantly improve both of your lives. And if, in addition, you occasionally have experiences that feel genuinely telepathic, experiences of knowing something you shouldn't be able to know, or sharing a moment of connection that transcends ordinary explanation, then receive these experiences with gratitude as mysterious gifts, without the need to transform them into a rigid belief system or proof of anything to others. So we return to the original question that started this whole journey. Does telepathic communication with pets work? And the most honest answer we can give after exploring all these angles is, something is definitely happening in the deep relationship between humans and their companion animals that goes beyond purely physical and behavioral interaction, involving emotional, intuitive, and possibly telepathic dimensions not yet fully understood or explained by mainstream science, but which is real enough in the lived experience of millions of people to deserve to be taken seriously, explored with curiosity, and honored with reverence, regardless of whether we eventually receive definitive scientific validation of the proposed mechanisms or not. This answer may frustrate people who want a definitive yes or no, but it is the most intellectually honest answer available given the current state of knowledge and evidence on the subject. And now, after all this, it's time for you to share your reflections, experiences, and questions. What resonated most strongly with you in everything we've explored? Do you feel inspired to try to develop deeper communication with your pet? Or do you remain skeptical but curious? Is there an experience you've had with your animal that you've never been able to fully explain and that perhaps you now see in a different light? Have the stories, evidence, and arguments presented changed your perspective in any way or confirmed what you already suspected? Leave all of this in the comments. Because this is a conversation that needs to continue, that needs multiple voices and perspectives, that is enriched by each personal story shared and each honest question raised. And if this deep dive into controversial yet fascinating territory brought you value, if it made you think in new ways, if it offered information and perspectives you hadn't previously had access to, then that means a lot, because it helps this content reach others who are also asking these questions and seeking balanced approaches that honor both intellectual rigor and experiential openness. And certainly subscribe to the channel if you want more in-depth explorations of topics at the intersection of science, consciousness, spirituality, and our relationship with the natural world, because this is territory we will return to again and again, always trying to deepen our understanding without losing the ability to question our own certainties. Until the next exploration, may you and your animal companion continue to discover new depths of connection, however you choose to name or understand what happens in those precious moments of interspecies communion. Let's now explore even more specific and practical dimensions that can make a real difference for people who are seriously committed to developing telepathic communication with their animals, going beyond theory and entering territories rarely discussed in sufficient depth. One of these crucial, but often overlooked areas is the role of your own emotional and energetic state in the quality and clarity of the telepathic communication you can establish. It's no coincidence that virtually every experienced animal communicator emphasizes the importance of doing deep personal work on emotional healing, developing self-awareness, and cultivating inner balance before hoping to become a clear channel for animal telepathic communication. The reason is simple but profound. If you are carrying unprocessed trauma, chronic emotional turmoil, obsessive thought patterns, or significant energetic blockages, all of this will create noise in your system that interferes with your ability to receive subtle signals from another consciousness. Think of it like trying to tune into a weak radio station while standing next to multiple sources of electromagnetic interference. The signal may be transmitting clearly, but you can't receive it through all the noise. Your internal state is literally the medium through which telepathic communication must pass to reach your waking consciousness. And if that medium is polluted, distorted, or blocked, The information that ultimately arrives will be correspondingly distorted or lost altogether. This explains why some people seem to have a natural facility for animal telepathic communication, while others struggle tremendously even when applying the same techniques. The difference often lies not in the technique, but in the level of cleanliness and clarity of their own receiving instrument. A person who has cultivated a Zen-like presence through decades of meditation, who has processed their traumas through deep therapy, who has developed genuine self-acceptance and inner peace, will naturally have a much easier time receiving clear telepathic communication than someone living in a constant state of anxiety, harsh self-criticism, emotional reactivity, and disconnection from their own body. This doesn't mean you need to be perfectly enlightened before you can begin practicing animal telepathic communication. That would be an impossible standard that would exclude virtually everyone. But it does mean that investing in your own personal growth, emotional healing, and spiritual development isn't a luxury separate from practicing animal communication, but is, in fact, an integral part of becoming an effective communicator. Any work you do to increase your ability to be present in the moment, reduce your incessant mental chatter, process difficult emotions rather than repress them, develop self-compassion, release rigid judgments about how things should be, and cultivate acceptance of what is. All of this directly improves your ability to communicate telepathically. Mindfulness meditation, somatic practices that increase body awareness, psychotherapy that helps process trauma and dysfunctional patterns, breathwork that releases energetic blockages, contemplative practices that expand consciousness, all contribute to clearing your receiving channel. There is also a physical and physiological dimension to telepathic communication that is rarely discussed but can make a substantial difference. The state of your nervous system directly impacts your ability to tune into subtle frequencies of information. When your nervous system is in a state of chronic sympathetic activation, that fight-or-flight mode that characterizes prolonged stress, your attention is fixated on scanning the environment for threats, rapidly processing multiple stimuli, and preparing for physical action. This state is absolutely terrible for telepathic receptivity because it requires the exact opposite: deep relaxation, soft and diffuse attention rather than focused and intense, receptive openness rather than defensiveness. Telepathic communication occurs much more easily when your nervous system is in a dominant parasympathetic state, that rest and digest mode characterized by a reduced heart rate, deep and slow breathing, relaxed muscle tone, and an overall sense of safety and openness. This means that anything you do to regulate your nervous system and promote parasympathetic activation will improve your telepathic ability. Specific breathing practices like deep diaphragmatic breathing, square breathing, where you equalize the duration of inhalation, retention, exhalation, and pause, or prolonged exhalation. Breathing that directly activates the vagus nerve can all quickly shift your physiological state in a way that facilitates telepathic communication. Regular exposure to nature, especially time spent in quiet natural environments away from intense urban stimuli, helps tremendously because nature has a proven effect on reducing sympathetic nervous system activation and promoting states of calm and presence. Gentle, mindful movement like yoga, tai chi, qigong, or simply meditative walking helps release stored tension in the body while cultivating a relaxed yet alert mental state ideal for telepathic work. Even basic things like adequate sleep, sufficient hydration, and nutrition that supports optimal neurological function rather than creating inflammation or blood sugar imbalances that cause emotional instability are all important for your ability to be a clear channel for subtle communication. Let's now delve into something that may be controversial, but that experienced communicators consistently report: the importance of clearing energies not only from your own system, but also from the environment where you practice telepathic communication. Many spiritual and shamanic traditions have specific practices for energetically clearing spaces, using elements such as smoke from sacred herbs, the sound of bells or singing bowls, visualization of light filling the space, or simply a clear intention to remove stagnant or negative energies. Skeptics will obviously dismiss this as baseless superstition. And it's true that we don't have validated scientific mechanisms explaining how these practices would work, if they do. But empirically, numerous practitioners report that telepathic communication flows much more easily in spaces that have been intentionally energetically cleared, and that environments charged with a heavy emotional history, recent conflict, or simply a lot of frenetic activity make telepathic communication more difficult. It could be that what's happening here isn't literally clearing metaphysical energies, but something more mundane, like creating a ritual that signals to your subconscious mind that it's now time to enter an altered state of consciousness appropriate for telepathic work, similar to how athletes have pre-competition rituals that put them in an optimal mental state. Or Or it could be that environments actually retain some kind of information or imprint of events that occurred within them through mechanisms we don't yet understand, and clearing practices somehow reset this. Regardless of the mechanism, if performing some kind of space-clearing ritual before telepathic communication sessions improves your results, then pragmatically there's value in doing so even without fully understanding why it works. This could be as simple as opening windows to circulate fresh air, playing calm, beautiful music to fill the space with a pleasant vibration, lighting a candle or incense as a ritual marker of sacred space, or making a loud statement of intention establishing that this space is now dedicated to clear and loving communication with your animal. Another rarely discussed but potentially important aspect is the timing of when you attempt telepathic communication. Some traditions suggest that there are times of day, lunar cycles, or even astrological alignments that are more favorable for intuitive and telepathic work. While this sounds like astrological superstition to the modern scientific mind, there are some objective facts that support the idea that timing matters. We know that circadian rhythms profoundly affect cognitive function, emotional state, and even the permeability of the barrier between conscious and subconscious. For most people, there is a window in the early morning, just after waking, and in the evening before sleep, where the mind is in a more fluid state, less dominated by linear rational thought, more open to intuitive impressions. These twilight moments of consciousness between sleep and full wakefulness are traditionally recognized in many cultures as times of greatest potential for mystical experiences, lucid dreams, intuitive insights, and apparently also for telepathic communication. Lunar cycles may seem more controversial, but there is research suggesting that lunar phases affect sleep, mood, and even rates of certain human behaviors, possibly through subtle effects on the Earth's geomagnetic field or through as yet unidentified mechanisms. Many animal communication practitioners report that telepathic work seems easier and clearer during a full or new moon, although there is no consensus on which phase is better. It may be worth experimenting with the timing of your practices and documenting whether you notice patterns in when communication flows more easily versus when you encounter more difficulty. You may find that you personally experience greater success at a certain time of day or lunar phase, and this information can be used pragmatically to optimize your practice, even if you don't have a complete theoretical explanation for why the pattern exists. There's also the whole issue of preparing the animal itself for telepathic communication that's often overlooked. We tend to assume that animals are always ready and willing to communicate telepathically, but just as humans vary in their openness and clarity, animals also fluctuate in their availability for this kind of deep connection. An animal that is stressed, scared, sick, exhausted, or in a state of high arousal won't be an ideal partner for telepathic communication. You want to choose moments when your animal is relaxed but alert, comfortable but not deeply asleep, and in a relatively neutral and positive emotional state rather than agitated or reactive. Some people develop small rituals that signal to the animal that it's time for deeper communication, perhaps a specific type of petting, a particular tone of voice, or sitting in a specific location that the animal learns to associate with these sessions. With time and repetition, you can effectively condition the animal to enter a more receptive state for telepathic communication when the ritual begins. There's also value in actively including the animal in the skill development process, rather than treating it as a passive recipient of your communication attempts. You can mentally ask the animal's permission before attempting to establish a telepathic connection, conveying respect for its autonomy and agency. You can mentally thank the animal when the session ends, acknowledging that communication is co-creation between the two of you, rather than you extracting information unilaterally. You can even ask the animal to teach you, to be patient with your initial mistakes, to help you learn how to receive communication from it more clearly. This attitude of humility and partnership rather than human dominance creates a relational dynamic more conducive to genuine communication. Animals are not objects or tools for you to practice mystical skills. They are conscious subjects with their own internal experiences, preferences, and boundaries that deserve to be respected throughout this process. Let's now address something that will make some people uncomfortable but needs to be said. There is a real risk of psychological and relational damage if you delve into animal telepathic communication in an obsessive or unbalanced way. Some people become so focused on developing telepathic abilities with their pets that it begins to dominate their lives in unhealthy ways, spending hours every day trying to receive messages, becoming anxious when they can't establish a clear connection, interpreting every small behavior from the animal as telepathic communication loaded with deep meaning, and essentially losing perspective on healthy boundaries. This can evolve into something akin to spiritual obsession, where the person believes they are constantly receiving profound messages from the animal about everything in life, and these supposed messages begin to guide important decisions in ways that may not be rational or in the best interests of anyone involved. There's also a danger of becoming so invested in telepathic communication with your animal that you begin to socially isolate it from other animals or even other humans, believing that the special telepathic connection between you means it doesn't need other relationships. This can be especially harmful to the animal, which, regardless of how deep its connection with you, still benefits from species-appropriate interactions and varied socialization that promotes complete psychological well-being. Animals don't exist solely to fulfill human emotional or spiritual needs. They have their own species-specific needs that must be met, and telepathic communication should never become an excuse to neglect these fundamental needs in favor of intensifying the mystical connection between human and animal. Related to this is the risk of using telepathic communication as a way to avoid facing difficult issues in your own life through excessive focus on your animal's inner life. If you're spending more time telepathically tuning into your cat's emotional states than dealing with your own troubled relationship, unfulfilling career, or unresolved family issues, then animal telepathic communication has become an avoidance mechanism rather than a genuine growth practice. Animals can absolutely be spiritual teachers, and their presence in our lives can catalyze profound growth, but they shouldn't be used as an escape from difficult personal work you need to do in other areas of your life. Genuine spiritual practices, including animal telepathic communication, should be empowering you to fully engage with all aspects of your life, not providing a refuge to hide from responsibilities and challenges you're avoiding. We also need to discuss the phenomenon of people who develop what could be called spiritual inflation or spiritual ego based on perceived abilities of animal telepathic communication. This happens when someone begins to believe that because they can communicate telepathically with animals, this makes them special, superior, or more spiritually evolved than ordinary people. They may begin to look down on people who don't believe in telepathic communication, feel like part of an enlightened spiritual elite, or use their supposed telepathic abilities to gain admiration and status in spiritual communities. This is a subtle but significant corruption of something that should be about humility, service, and a deeper connection with all life. True telepathic ability, if it exists, should never inflate your ego, but rather dissolve it through a visceral recognition of the fundamental interconnectedness between all forms of consciousness and the impossibility of true superiority when you realize that consciousness is viewing itself through infinite different forms. Genuine animal communication teachers invariably emphasize that the deeper you develop the skill, the more humble you become because you begin to realize how little you truly know, how easily you can be wrong in your interpretations, how complex and mysterious consciousness truly is, and how great your responsibility is to use any heightened sensitivity you develop in genuine service to the well-being of animals rather than to inflate your own ego. If you notice that your telepathic communication practice is making you feel special, superior, or separate from others rather than more connected, compassionate, and humble, this is a red flag that you have strayed from the path and need to make a serious course correction before the damage deepens. Let's now explore how animal telepathic communication intersects with other spiritual and consciousness practices that many people may be exploring simultaneously. For people who meditate regularly, animal telepathic communication can become a natural extension of meditative practices, with communication sessions essentially being focused meditations where the object of attention is the animal's consciousness rather than breathing or another traditional meditative anchor. For people involved in energy work such as Reiki, Qigong, or other energy healing modalities, attuning to animal energy fields can be similar to how they already attune to human energy fields, with the same sensitivities applying across species. For people with shamanic practices, communication with physical animals can intertwine with work with power animals or animal spirit guides, creating a multi-dimensional relationship with the animal kingdom that operates simultaneously on physical and spiritual levels. For people exploring psychic development more broadly, animal telepathic communication can be a way to practice and fine-tune intuitive skills in a relatively safe, low-consequence context before applying these skills to more complex and charged human situations. Many professional mediums and psychics report that they began practicing with animals before giving readings to people because animals are less judgmental. Their messages tend to be more direct and less psychologically complicated than humans, and there is less risk of causing harm if you misinterpret or misinterpret. For people on yoga or tantra paths, telepathic union with an animal can be seen as a way to practice dissolving boundaries between self and other, an experiential recognition of the non-separation that these traditions point to as the ultimate nature of reality. The beauty is that animal telepathic communication can complement and integrate with virtually any spiritual path or consciousness practice you are already following, rather than requiring you to adopt an entire new belief system. But we also need to recognize that for some people, especially those with certain mental health conditions, delving deeply into practices like animal telepathic communication can be counterproductive or even dangerous. People with psychotic tendencies, schizophrenia, or schizotypal disorder may have difficulty maintaining clear boundaries between genuine telepathic impressions and hallucinations or delusions, and practices that deliberately blur the lines between consensual reality and internal subjective experiences can exacerbate symptoms. People with borderline personality disorder or other disorders characterized by an unstable sense of self and relationships may use animal telepathic communication in ways that reinforce dysfunctional patterns rather than promote healing. People with severe anxiety or obsessive-compulsive tendencies may become anxious and obsessed with correctly interpreting every possible telepathic message from their animals, turning something that should be a source of connection into a source of additional stress. This doesn't mean that people with these conditions should be categorically excluded from exploring animal telepathic communication, but it does mean that they need to approach it with extra caution, ideally with the support of mental health professionals who understand both the specific condition and spiritual practices, and with a commitment to stopping or modifying the practice if it is clearly causing deterioration rather than improvement in overall psychological functioning. For these individuals, it may be more appropriate to first focus on stabilization through conventional treatment, and only then, once a solid foundation of psychological stability is established, to carefully explore more advanced practices of consciousness such as telepathic communication. Brutal honesty about one's own psychological state and current capabilities is a form of self-respect and personal responsibility, not a sign of weakness or failure. We now reach territory that will take this discussion to even deeper and potentially more controversial layers. The role of animal telepathic communication in how we understand consciousness, death, the survival of consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality. If you accept that telepathic communication with living animals is possible, this raises profound philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness. Conventional scientific materialism treats consciousness as an epiphenomenon of the physical brain, something that emerges from complex neurochemical processes but has no existence independent of the physical substrate that produces it. Under this model, consciousness ends when the brain dies, and communication between separate consciousnesses requires physical signals transmitted through physical sensory channels. Genuine telepathy simply shouldn't be possible under these materialist assumptions, because it would require information transfer without a physical means of transmission. If telepathic communication is real, it suggests that consciousness has aspects or capabilities that transcend the physical limitations of the brain, that information can be transmitted through non-physical channels or channels not yet recognized by current physics, and that consciousnesses can intersect or connect in ways that go beyond interaction through physical bodies. This does not necessarily prove dualism in the sense of an immaterial soul completely separated from the physical body, but it at least suggests that purely materialistic models of consciousness are incomplete, and that we need to expand our understanding to accommodate phenomena that currently do not fit comfortably into the dominant paradigm. This is part of the reason why animal telepathic communication and psychic phenomena in general encounter so much resistance in mainstream scientific academia, because accepting the reality of these phenomena would require a fundamental revision of the philosophical assumptions that underpin the entire edifice of modern scientific materialism. And then we have the even more charged question of communicating with animals that have already died. If you can communicate telepathically with a living animal through some kind of consciousness-to-consciousness connection, what happens to this ability when the animal dies and there is no longer a functioning physical brain? Materialists would say that communication should obviously cease because there is no longer a conscious entity to communicate with. The animal's consciousness ceased to exist when the brain stopped functioning. But multiple animal communicators and thousands of bereaved owners report experiences of continued communication with deceased animals that feel as real and specific as the communication they had with a living animal. These include vivid dreams, where the animal appears and communicates messages, sensations of the animal's presence in specific locations, telepathic impressions of comfort or farewell, even visual or auditory apparitions of the animal that multiple people witness simultaneously. Skeptics have ready-made explanations: psychological needs of mourning creating comforting hallucinations, vivid memories of the animal being confused with current communication, a desperate desire to continue connection, generating subjective experiences that seem real but have no objective basis. And certainly, much of what is interpreted as communication with deceased animals probably falls into these categories. But when you have cases where a person receives specific information in a dream or telepathic impression from a deceased animal that they had no way of knowing beforehand, and that is later verified as accurate, or when multiple people independently report similar experiences with the same deceased animal without comparing notes first, conventional explanations begin to become strained. I'm not arguing that the survival of animal consciousness after death is proven, far from it. But I am suggesting that if you accept the possibility of telepathic communication with living animals, you at least need to seriously consider questions about what happens to this communication capacity when the death transition occurs, rather than simply assuming that materialism is correct and all post-mortem communication experiences are illusory. This territory inevitably leads us to questions about animal reincarnation, something that some spiritual traditions fully embrace, but that Western science ignores or dismisses. There are people who report recognizing the consciousness of a deceased animal returning in the body of a new offspring, sometimes with similar physical markings, sometimes with identical behavioral quirks that would be statistically unlikely by coincidence, sometimes with demonstrations of knowledge about people, places, or events that the new animal should have no way of knowing. The book, The Art of Racing in the Rain, and cases studied by researchers like Ian Stevenson touch on this territory, although Stevenson focused primarily on cases of human reincarnation. Again, the evidence is by no means conclusive, and multiple alternative explanations exist. But for people who have personally experienced these experiences, the sensation of rediscovering familiar consciousness in a new body can be absolute and transformative, regardless of external scientific validation. All of this points to broader philosophical and spiritual questions about what animals truly are in terms of consciousness and spiritual significance. Modern materialist traditions treat animals essentially as complex biological machines, perhaps with some level of subjective experience, but fundamentally less valuable and meaningful than human life. But if animals are capable of genuine telepathic communication, if their consciousness survives physical death, if they reincarnate for soul growth purposes similar to humans, then perhaps they are far more similar to us in terms of spiritual significance than we traditionally recognize. Perhaps the rigid division between humans as unique beings with immortal souls and animals as purely physical, temporary creatures is a particular cultural construct rather than a metaphysical truth. Many indigenous and Eastern traditions have always treated animals as complete spiritual beings, walking their own evolutionary paths, and perhaps animal telepathic communication, when developed deeply, eventually reveals this more expansive truth about the interconnected spiritual nature of all consciousness. But let's return to more practical territory, because metaphysical speculation, while fascinating, needs to be balanced with concrete application. One of the most valuable and immediately useful applications of telepathic sensitivity developed with animals is in the area of behavioral rehabilitation for traumatized or rescued animals. Animal shelters, rescue organizations, and individual rehabilitators who develop telepathic communication skills report that it can make a dramatic difference in their ability to help deeply traumatized animals heal. When you can telepathically tune in to an abused dog and truly feel and understand the specific trauma they carry, you can develop a therapeutic approach much more precisely calibrated to that individual's needs, rather than applying a generic protocol. You can telepathically communicate that they are safe now, that they will not be hurt again, that they can trust. And while these verbal communications may not be fully processed by the animal the way human language would, the energetic and emotional transmission of safety, love, and protective commitment seems to be received and can dramatically accelerate the healing process. There are animal communicators who work specifically with difficult cases in shelters, animals so traumatized that they are considered unadoptable and scheduled for euthanasia. Through telepathic communication, they can sometimes identify specific trauma triggers, reveal the animal's history that explains seemingly incomprehensible behaviors, and establish a foundation of trust that allows rehabilitation work to begin in a way that was not possible when the animal was completely shut away and inaccessible. Obviously, this needs to be combined with conventional evidence-based behavioral techniques, medication when appropriate, and professional veterinary behavioral expertise, but the telepathic dimension adds a layer of understanding and connection that can be missing in particularly challenging cases. When these interventions work and an animal previously considered lost heals sufficiently to be adopted into a loving home, the pragmatic value of telepathic communication becomes self-evident, regardless of theoretical debates about mechanisms. Another important application is in end-of-life and euthanasia decisions, arguably the most emotionally charged area where telepathic communication can offer guidance. Deciding when to euthanize a suffering animal is one of the most heartbreaking decisions owners face, fraught with guilt, fear of acting too soon and prolonging suffering, and fear of waiting too long and letting the animal suffer unnecessarily. Animal communicators working with end-of-life situations often help owners navigate this decision by telepathically attuning to the animal itself about what it wants, how it is feeling about its dying process, whether it is ready to go or wants more time. Obviously, this needs to be balanced with an objective veterinary assessment of quality of life, pain level, and prognosis. But the telepathic dimension of truly asking the animal and seeking its perspective can bring peace and clarity that allows the owner to make a decision in alignment with the animal's own wishes, rather than just their own fear or attachment. There are heartbreaking stories of animals telepathically communicating that they were ready to go, but wanted to wait until a specific moment, perhaps until a missing family member returned to say goodbye, or even after a significant event they wanted to experience. And there are reports of animals communicating that they weren't ready yet, despite a veterinarian suggesting euthanasia would be appropriate, and owners deciding to give the animal more time based on this communication, only for the animal to demonstrate amazing rallying and live additional months of reasonable quality. Again, these decisions should never be based solely on telepathic impressions without serious consideration of veterinary medical evaluation. But when genuine telepathic communication can occur, it adds the animal's own voice to the conversation in a way that honors its agency and autonomy, even at the end of its life. So, where does all this leave us after this profound journey through every conceivable aspect of animal telepathic communication? We've reached a point where we need to integrate everything we've explored into a coherent understanding that acknowledges complexity, embraces paradox, and offers a practical path forward without requiring you to resolve every philosophical and scientific question before you can begin. The truth is that telepathic communication with pets exists in a fascinating liminal zone between a deeply real subjective experience and an objectively verifiable phenomenon, between a natural ability we all possess to some degree and a sophisticated art that requires years of dedicated practice to master, between an emerging science that is just beginning to develop adequate instruments and frameworks to investigate, and an ancient tradition that has always known this connection was possible. What we know with reasonable certainty is that the relationship between humans and their companion animals operates on dimensions that go far beyond verbal commands and food rewards. That there is deep emotional synchronization occurring at measurable neurological levels, that animals demonstrate perceptual and cognitive capabilities that continue to surprise researchers as studies become more sophisticated, and that millions of people around the world report experiences of connection with their pets that seem to transcend conventional, purely physical explanations. We know that practicing deep presence with animals, cultivating heightened empathic sensitivity, and learning to quiet the mind enough to receive subtle impressions can definitely deepen your relationship with your pet in ways that benefit both of your well-being. We know that when people learn to more deeply attune themselves to their animals through practices they call telepathic communication, they often become more attentive, responsive, and compassionate pet owners, even if the exact mechanisms involved remain debated. What we don't know with definitive certainty is whether there is a literal transfer of information occurring through non-physical channels or channels not yet identified by science, or whether what is experienced as telepathic communication is actually an extraordinarily sophisticated orchestration of micro-body language reading, subconscious processing of subtle sensory cues, deep empathic resonance through mirror neurons, and narrative elaboration of raw emotional impressions into seemingly more complex messages. Honestly, for the practical purposes of improving your relationship with your pet and increasing their well-being, this distinction may not matter as much as it seems. If practicing telepathic communication techniques results in you becoming more attuned to your pet's needs, better able to sense when something is wrong, more responsive to their emotional states, and more connected on a deep level that enriches both your lives, then the practice has tremendous value regardless of whether we eventually discover the mechanisms are purely physical, even if not yet fully understood. What is crucial to avoid is the extreme of closed-minded skepticism that dismisses all experiences as illusion without genuine investigation, but equally to avoid the extreme of uncritical credulity that accepts all claims as truth without any discernment. The middle path involves maintaining an open but critical mind, genuine curiosity grounded in intellectual honesty, a willingness to experiment personally, but with a commitment to honestly documenting results, including failures, and the humility to recognize that there is still much we do not understand about consciousness, communication, and possible connections between different life forms. It means being willing to have your worldview expanded by experiences that do not fit neatly into current paradigms, while maintaining the ability to question your own interpretations of those experiences and consider alternative explanations. For those who decide to seriously embark on this journey of developing deeper communication with their pets through telepathic or intuitive practices, here are final guiding principles that can help you navigate the path in a way that maximizes genuine growth while minimizing potential pitfalls. First, always prioritize the animal's true physical and emotional well-being above your curiosity about mystical phenomena. Never allow exploration of telepathic communication to replace appropriate veterinary care, adequate nutrition, healthy socialization, and meeting all the species' basic needs. Second, practice brutal honesty with yourself about what you are truly perceiving versus what you are interpreting or elaborating. Keep a detailed journal that clearly distinguishes between immediate impressions and subsequent interpretations. And be willing to admit when you were wrong or projecting rather than receiving genuine communication. Third, cultivate humility by recognizing that even if you develop true telepathic sensitivity, you will never have complete access to the inner experience of another consciousness. There will always be mystery and residual opacity in the other that must be respected, rather than assumed you fully understand. Fourth, use any heightened sensitivity you develop in genuine service to the animal's well-being rather than to inflate your own ego or social status, remembering that the ultimate purpose is to deepen love and connection rather than to prove something to yourself or others. Fifth, maintain a healthy balance where animal telepathic communication is part of a rich and varied life rather than an obsessive focus that excludes other relationships, responsibilities, and paths of growth, recognizing that your animal is an important teacher but not your only teacher or significant relationship. Sixth, continue educating yourself on both current science of animal cognition, behavior, and well-being, as well as spiritual traditions and intuitive communication practices, allowing these different forms of knowledge to inform each other rather than treating them as mutually exclusive opposites. Seventh, connect with a community of other practitioners where you can share experiences, ask questions, and receive feedback, but maintain critical discernment about any teachings or practices that are presented as absolute truth, or that require significant financial investment before you have personal evidence of their value. Eighth, be patient with the process, recognizing that developing genuine telepathic abilities, if possible, takes time and sustained practice over months and years, rather than instant transformation after a weekend course. Ninth, be alert for signs that your practice is making you more anxious, obsessed, isolated, or unbalanced, rather than more peaceful, connected, and integrated. And be willing to modify or pause your practice if it isn't serving your overall well-being. 10th, remember that the ultimate goal isn't to develop impressive superpowers, but rather to deepen your capacity to love across species boundaries, expand your circle of compassion beyond humans to include all sentient life forms, and live in greater alignment with the recognition of the fundamental interconnectedness of all consciousness. If animal telepathic communication serves these deeper purposes of ethical and spiritual growth, then it has fulfilled its most important function, regardless of academic debates about mechanisms. And finally, allow yourself to hold the paradox of not knowing definitively while still practicing fully. You don't need to resolve all the philosophical and scientific questions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of telepathy before you can begin to sit silently with your animal, open your heart, quiet your mind, and see what emerges in that space of deep connection. You don't need absolute certainty about what is real before you can trust the subtle first impressions that arrive and pragmatically test them to see if they prove useful and accurate. You don't need external validation or official credentials before you can honor your own experiences as valid and meaningful to you. Start where you are, with the animal that shares your life now, with the motivation to simply know it more deeply and connect more fully, and let the journey unfold organically without rigid expectations about where it should lead. The relationship between humans and animals is one of the oldest and most profound connections known to our species, dating back tens of thousands of years to the first wolves that approached human campfires, beginning a partnership that eventually produced the full diversity of domestic dogs we know today. Throughout this shared history, humans and animals have found ways to communicate, cooperate, comfort each other, and create bonds that transcend pure practical utility. In a modern world that often feels fragmented, isolated, and disconnected from nature, the relationship with pets offers one of the last, direct and intimate connections many people have with the living natural world beyond humanity. Exploring deeper communication with these animal companions is not mystical frivolity, but rather part of an urgently needed reconnection with dimensions of existence that alienated modernity has obscured but not completely destroyed. Every time you sit with your animal in genuine presence, every time you truly see them as a conscious subject rather than a decorative or possessed object, every time you try to tune in to what they might be feeling or needing, Rather than simply projecting your own interpretations, you are practicing a form of love that has the potential to expand far beyond that specific relationship. You are cultivating a capacity for empathy that can eventually extend to all beings. You are developing a sensitivity to consciousness in non-human forms that can fundamentally change how you move in the world and what ethical choices you make about food, the products you buy, and the habitats you support and protect. Animal telepathic communication, if approached with integrity, is not about becoming special, but about becoming more fully human in the deepest, most connected, responsible, and compassionate sense that humanity can express. So, we have truly reached the end of this massive exploration of telepathic communication with pets. Having examined ancestral history and cultural context, emerging scientific evidence, and legitimate methodological critiques, proposed mechanisms from mirror neurons to speculative quantum physics, reported experiences of professional communicators and ordinary pet owners, species differences in communication styles, specific practical exercises for skill development, psychological and spiritual. Pitfalls to avoid, valuable applications in rehabilitation and end-of-life contexts, profound philosophical questions about consciousness and survival after death, and finally, guiding principles for balanced and integrated practice. If you have come this far on this journey with me, you have already demonstrated a commitment to deep exploration and nuanced thinking that will serve you well as you continue your own personal exploration of this fascinating territory. Now it's your turn to share where you are on this journey. After everything we've explored together, do you feel more inclined to try telepathic communication with your own pet? Or do you remain skeptical, perhaps with a slightly more open skepticism than before? Is there a specific experience you've had with your animal that you now see in a different light, perhaps recognizing as a possible moment of telepathic communication that you previously dismissed? Or perhaps you already practice animal telepathic communication and have additional insights or experiences that would enrich this conversation? Are there aspects I haven't covered or questions you still have that could be addressed in future content? Leave them in the comments, because this is a lively conversation that benefits from every additional perspective, every personal story, every honest question that contributes to our evolving collective understanding. And if this deep exploration brought you real value, if you appreciated the balanced approach that attempts to honor both intellectual rigor and experiential openness, both science and spirituality, both healthy skepticism and genuine curiosity, then that like is a concrete way to support this kind of substantive content that takes real time and considerable effort to create. Likes aren't just ego validation, but a signal to algorithms that this kind of in-depth and nuanced exploration of complex topics has an audience that values it, allowing more similar content to be created and reach people asking these same questions. And of course, subscribing to the channel ensures you don't miss future explorations of topics related to animal consciousness, interspecies relationships, the frontiers of mind science, contemplative and spiritual practices, and all the fascinating questions that live at the intersection of what we know scientifically and what we mysteriously experience. This is just the beginning of much broader conversations we need to have about how we relate to other forms of consciousness on this planet, about what it means to be human in a world shared with countless other sentient species, about how science and spirituality can inform each other rather than remain in rigid opposition, about how we develop both rigorous critical thinking and openness to dimensions of reality that our current paradigms still don't adequately explain. Your participation in this conversation through comments, shares, and genuine engagement with the ideas presented is what makes this more than a monologue and transforms it into a collective dialogue where we all learn together. Thank you for dedicating your time and attention to this profound exploration. And may you and your companion animal continue to discover new levels of connection, understanding, and mutual love. Call it telepathic communication, or simply the mysterious and precious bond that makes life shared with animals one of the most enriching experiences humans can know. Until our next deep dive into territories where science, experience, and mystery meet.